I'm John Hupalo, Chairman of the Wastewater Committee. And as I said, our brethren in the Environmental Committee and the Wastewater Committee got together to try to find the first of what we hope will be a series of communications to the community about this whole problem of nitrogen, innovative and alternative wastewater systems, and related issues. So there's no one better in our community to start this process than one of our own residents, Jim Kremer. Let me tell you a little bit about Jim's background here at Point Woods and his professional engagements, which all, Jim, seem to be related to water, sort of one way or the other. For those who like trivia, Jim's parents met here in the 30s. Unfortunately, the Ash Wednesday storm of 1963 took their cottage. So that water event was not a happy one, I'm sure, in your home. But maybe it sort of got you on the way to understanding what water impacts and the environment mean here at Point of Woods. What you may not know about Jim also is that he's a two-time All-American swimmer, captain of the Princeton team back in the day. What was your event?
Backstroke and individual medley.
Backstroke and individual medley. So if there's ever a trivia question about Jim Kremer's All-American, we know now what the answer is. So that is absolutely fantastic. Of course, Jim and Pat have been great neighbors and ours here very many years, and I have to personally thank them for the 2 years they rented their cottage to us, our 2 dogs, and 2 very young children. So we survived that, and they did as well. So I really appreciate that. On to Jim's academic credentials, which are really quite outstanding and just so perfectly aligned with what we're going to talk about today. Jim was focused on water issues from his days at USC and then at UConn, where he created an undergraduate major in the Department of Marine Sciences related to the combination of natural science, environmental law, policy. So really has been in this for his entire career. He's also written and published more than I've probably read in my lifetime. He can tell you more about this. He says his CV is 7 pages long. He gave me only 10 publications. The one that caught me, that many of you have a hankering to know more about the problems with the epi curve and an empirical alternative, Jim will be glad to send you that paper, I'm sure. So without further ado, again, Jim, thank you. Thanks to the Wastewater Committee. Thanks to the Environmental Committee for getting us going on some important topic.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. It's fun to sit here and hear that story told again and feel that you all know more about me than I thought you would know, but that's great. Pat, how are we doing? We're getting ready to go?
Yep.
So we are Zooming with a whole separate computer view. My presentation is self-contained and Pat is handling the Zoom. So from time to time, we'll stop and make sure, like in the questions, we'll make sure whether we've got good questions or not. And I got to check in with her frequently and make sure that we're ready to go. She's now going to share the screen with her Zoom participants, and we're going to go in parallel. She's going to advance the slides as I advance the slides here, because I have some notes up here in addition to just the slides. Everybody can hear me okay? Oh, thank you. So what's all this fuss about nitrogen? When I was working on this problem in Connecticut some years ago, I was working on how coastal watersheds, the activity of humans in coastal watersheds, deliver nitrogen to the coastal zone and cause environmental problems there. That's what we're going to talk about. That's what is facing Point of Woods right now. I did a lot of this work some time ago. I retired in 2008, so I haven't been active in the field since then. I had prepared this talk to give as a public outreach presentation many years ago at about that time. And I thought, well, gosh, when John gave his presentation at the Stockholm meeting, he said, if I could find that PowerPoint, I could give something that the committee might find useful. So that was the background here. There are some graphs of trends over time. They stopped a while ago. I didn't update a lot of those graphs. But I can assure you that all those trends continue, and if anything, they've gotten worse. So you're not missing anything there. And finally, at the end of the talk, we'll touch on the remediation technology, which is what's facing the wastewater committee. They have to make some decisions for Point of Woods about how we're going to try to remediate this problem that humans are having and that Point of Woods people are having. So I'm ready to go to the first slide. Hold your breath. This one's going to be a shock. Don't let it be. I hope it doesn't. All these words are familiar to you. I think we'll go through them very briefly. But the context of the story I want to tell you depends upon seeing these boxes and understanding that the way we deal with elements and chemicals in the environment depends upon whether they are in the active biosphere. So the green, the brown, and the gray boxes are active, and the little red arrow shows that they are constantly turning around in the biological cycles. And the components of that are familiar. We've got plants, animals, and microbes, and they are living organic matter. I want to use these words carefully, so precisely. I want to use these words and emphasize them so that you focus on them as we hear them later on. So we're in the organic realm. We're on the organic, active biosphere, organic materials, plants, animals, and microbes. Well, you're hearing something about them. And then there's the non-living components, which are chemical degradation products, but they're still active in the processes. So fats, proteins, and carbohydrates are both the raw materials for the growth of living things. They're also the part of the recycling process of the microbe cycle. When the microbes act on this, they move from the organic to the inorganic, and then they get reduced. The chemicals now are the same elements, but they're different molecules. If you remember living chemistry, they're now broken down into these building blocks. And we'll hear about phosphate and nitrate, and we won't talk anymore. We won't talk much about ammonia. But then there's this big barrier here, or the things that are away. I will in the later slide tell you that there is no away. We can't throw things away. But for our purposes to start with, phosphorus that's bound into rocks and buried in the earth, or nitrogen gas, which is the most abundant gas in our atmosphere, are inert. They're chemically inert. They do not interact. They don't interact in chemical reactions. So they are, for all intents and purposes, away from this active biosphere. Okay, so everybody with me on that? That wasn't too bad, right? Good. Okay. Oops. I went the wrong way. Okay, so treating domestic waste. We're going to finish up with some of the ideas that have led us to solutions to this problem. But very briefly, the early challenge that was tossed out to the engineers who were going to do, the sanitary engineers who were going to do the treatment of organic waste, was to remove organics, they're smelly and gross, and to kill the pathogens. That's the challenge that they set out to follow. This happens in nature all the time. Bacterial decay burns those organics and turns them back into building blocks, and it's capable of killing the pathogens. So if we build a system that uses those natural organisms, we can do the job that the sanitary engineers said we can do this, can do. The problem is those septic systems do this very well, but they create a lot of building blocks. Remember those inorganic compounds, which we're pretty much nobody worried about. So that's the point I just made. Phosphate, ammonium, nitrate, these are the building block compounds which are inorganic, and they were not part of the problem. But they are a problem, and the story we're going to see emerge historically, and then the one that we've got to treat, is because phosphorus, even down to rocks, can eventually cause trouble in waterways. Nitrogen, and it's a curiosity that phosphorus pollutes fresh water and causes algal growth and problems in the ecology of fresh waters, rivers and streams and lakes. And we've been fighting the problem of phosphates in detergents for years because of the fresh water pollution they cause. That's not a poison, it's just an inorganic molecule which is now put into the environment when it was at much higher levels than it should have been. And then the curiosity is phosphate is that problem in fresh water, but nitrogen is the problem in salt water. That's a fascinating story. We don't have time for it today, but let's meet nitrogen. 80% of the atmosphere is this inactive nitrogen. So this is a graph of nitrogen. It's abundant, and most of it is inactive. The active nitrogen it rounds to 0%. But we'll start with this inactive pool. That pie is essentially 100% nitrogen gas on our planet. So there's a lot of nitrogen. And this is a picture of the molecule. Nitrogen is inert because it is chemically bound. It's like a dancer, it's like two dancers with three arms holding really tight to each other, and they don't let go. So that nitrogen molecule, N2, is so tightly bound that it doesn't enter into chemical reactions. There is some active nitrogen. It's way less than, it's on, it's on the order of 1%, and that's the organic and inorganic, which I just told you about. So nitrogen is here around us. Every time you take a breath, you take in 80% of that volume of gas. 80% is nitrogen, 20% is oxygen, a little less than that, and the rest of CO2 and all the other gases in there are way tinier. This imbalance, mostly inert, and a small fraction going around that cycle is the way nature works. And there's no waste in nature. All those recycled, all those materials go around and around, organic, inorganic, living, dead. That loop takes place and has been working for a long time very, very well. Oh, yeah, okay. So it's a big imbalance in nature. So this is a confusing graph, but we don't have to spend, but I hope we don't have to spend too long on it. So we're going to look at deforestation, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, human population growth, and the industrialization to produce lots of fertilizer from atmospheric nitrogen. And this graph says, when was it 25% of the present day problem or the present day amount? And for deforestation, it was 25% of the present day problem in 1700, and by 1900, it was 75% of the problem. And so all the stuff that you heard about deforestation as a problem has happened since 1900, and it's only the last 25% of the problem. But look how long it took from 1700 to 1900. And these graphs go on, I just don't have the updated information. CO2 really sets the carbon problem in the atmosphere. That one's been happening for a long time, and you know that it has exploded recently, and we're really terrified about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's that one, but it's taken that long to develop, so to speak. Human population growth is also screaming up. But here's the one we're going to focus on today, the industrial capture of nitrogen gas and the conversion into a form that thrusts it into the active ecosystem, the active biosphere, is what has taken place really recently and is just explosive. Make sure I look at my notes so I don't forget to say this. So these are the building blocks, that phosphate and that nitrogen, nitrate and ammonium. You can buy ammonium nitrate, it's a great plant fertilizer. Those are two of the active nitrogen building blocks, and you pay good money for them as fertilizer. And this graph says phosphorus versus nitrogen added to the landscape. So, and it's per unit area. So if we said how much nitrogen is delivered from the outside world to an acre of land. This is a scale that goes up by powers of 10, 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, oops, 10,000, 10 to 10,000, 100,000 here. So how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus are we basically? She needs that. John, she needs that. Oh.
It's okay.
I got clearance. Don't worry.
It's okay.
Okay. She doesn't need it for. So the circle is coastal waters. We are inadvertently, no, unintentionally delivering rates of fertilization of phosphorus and nitrogen, the two essential elements that you pay money for at the hardware store or the garden shop, to put onto your plants on purpose so they will grow. And look, we are orders of magnitude higher than the most that's ever used in agriculture. And wetlands, lakes, and forests, which you've heard about, are having problems because they get so much nutrient addition. Yes. Is that a little better there? Oh, sorry. I just put my thumb in the way between me and the mic. That works. Thank you for speaking up. Please, if you have corrections like that, do speak up. So we're over-fertilizing coastal waters is that take-home graph, and it's because of human activities. It didn't happen before because these things were tightly linked in a loop. So here's a simple conceptual model. We'll see a before and after graph, before and after picture. These are the natural processes with the landscape. It's rain falling and uptake by the forested watershed. Groundwater is coming down slope, and rain runoff is seeping into the salt water. This would be Great South Bay. And then there's exchange with the ocean, and there's processes going along with the bottom. This is the sort of natural Great South Bay long ago, and groundwater came through here, but most of these processes were tightly bound and there were not excess levels of nutrients in it. This is what we've done to it. And it's a cartoon, but it pretty much captures the idea. So in this graph, we have lots of changes. the rain is affected by industrial emissions and chemicals that are released from the smokestacks of factories is dissolved in the water and come down in rain. So we deliver a lot of nitrogen and sulfur. You've heard of acid rain with lakes. That's sulfur from power plants and stuff. Rain has nitrogen in it. Fertilizer, we're putting fertilizer on our lawns. We're growing agriculture. That's a mall. This is some sort of a mall with a lot of parking surfaces. So a lot of dry deposition falls out of the atmosphere and accumulates on impervious dry surfaces. And then when it rains, those surfaces are washed clear, and all of that material washes off and floods into these coastal waters. And then we've got houses and streets. And so let's see, I got street runoff, residential septic tanks. And that causes so many changes in the coastal waterways. And we'll see that in a moment, that eelgrass, which is a desirable plant and an indicator of a healthy coastal shallow ecosystem, essentially eelgrass can't survive anymore. So we're taking the temperature or the blood pressure of the system. When eelgrass starts to die, we're going to ask why, and these are the kinds of things we're going to look for. Just a quick glimpse at the scales at which this problem has an impact. So this is some data that we took where we measured oxygen every few centimeters down. This is meters. So this is about 6, 3 foot. This is like a 6 foot. This is a pond which is only 5 or 5 feet, less than 2 meters, 5 feet deep. It's a shallow system, and in the daytime it produces. Because when the sunlight, oxygen is produced. In the nighttime, the oxygen is depleted, and it goes from way abundant during the daytime to down to almost zero in the nighttime. So this system is going totally anoxic for creatures that live on the bottom, and it's only 5 feet deep. Here's Long Island Sound. I know one, but anyway. So these graphs represent the concentration of oxygen in the bottom waters of Long Island Sound. The same processes, over-fertilization, plants grow, sinks to the bottom, those plants die and use up all the oxygen. So that's on a scale like Great South Bay or Long Island Sound. And here we are, a quick look at the central US. This yellow is the drainage basin to the Gulf of Mexico. It's a massive watershed. All of this, the Mississippi River reaching the Gulf of Mexico. All of this is one watershed with all these rivers. Lots of agriculture, fertilizer applied, all of this agriculture runs into the Gulf of Mexico. Very little of agriculture uses the nitrogen, which was already part of the natural cycle. Virtually all of the agriculture work that is done in this whole watershed, which eventually, any excess runs downriver, is additional nitrogen that we've taken from the atmosphere and put it from the inactive inert section into the active section. And this is, you may have heard about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So here is a large expanse of water at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, right near the Mississippi Delta. And this is, they track this every year now, and it's been getting bigger and bigger and having longer and longer extent. So we want to look and try to understand in more detail at what processes, starting with human population and involving nitrogen, contaminate or basically cause these changes in our natural systems. People like to live near the water. Here we are. I don't have to say too much more about that. Here's some data. As a function of time, US, total United States, coastal counties people have been moving to live on the coast, no surprise. What do all these people do? Well, as populations go up by a decade, so a tenth of a person per square kilometer, one person, 10 people, 100, 1,000, another scale which goes up by a factor of 10 every time. So this graph is really exploding. And how much does the nitrogen, it's the export, don't need to worry about the unit too much. This is what mass of nitrogen are delivered per square area. That's a square kilometer or a square kilometer. So those 10 people are delivering about 100 kilograms onto their square kilometer. So the axes are both tracking what's happening on the same unit area. Make sense? And boy, this this is a super explosive change because it is not a straight line. Well, it appears to be a straight line only because it's this long double axis. And these are the major rivers. It's been too long. That's why. Okay, so where are these coming from? This is the atmospheric nitrogen, and which is inert. But when we burn petroleum, fossil fuels, we not only do the CO2, we not only make CO2, which used to be buried in the ground as fossilized carbon, and we exhume that fossilized material and we spew it into the atmosphere. And CO2 is bad not because it's CO2, it's because it's been buried for so long and has been not part of the active cycle. And that's why the carbon problem is so bad. The exact same thing has happened with nitrogen. When you burn petroleum, there's nitrogen in that's dead organic matter. And that under combustion makes nitrous oxides, which are basically fertilizer. So this has a process of releasing nitrogen, which used to be stored in fossil fuels, and coal and petroleum are the same way. And then there's also a process we figured out because we want to make more fertilizers. In addition to these, combustion of our fossil fuels, we also grab nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into an active form for the fertilizers, which we manufacture industrially. When we make gunpowder, I'm not sure about gunpowder, lightning does it to a very small degree, but there are a few processes by which that triple bond of nitrogen is broken and it moves from the inert side to the active side. And people have been really clever about figuring out how to do that. This is our superpower. I changed it, I put the nitrogen molecule there. So people have figured out how to make fertilizer from the atmospheric nitrogen. And when they do that, they can have a big impact on agriculture. So what does that mean? Let's look at the graph. This is the time from up until around 2000. That's pretty good. And this is a large mass of nitrogen over time. So these graphs are these typical explosive growths. This is the amount from fossil fuel. This is a natural process from growing plants that like beans and legumes can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. There's plants that are capable of doing this magical trick that lets them use the nitrogen and put it into their plant growth. So they get to mobilize that inert form. So that's the green one is a natural process, but that's an unnatural process. That's an unnatural process. And the total amount of nitrogen that we're adding new to the system, which was not part of the natural cycle, has been exploding exponentially. The word eutrophication basically is a technical scientific term for too much fertilizer. We're stimulating the plant growth in an unnatural way, and that's called eutrophication. But wait a minute. In the central farmlands of the U.S., that's where we're growing the food. This is the watershed, and we're in fact fertilizing 1,840 units. These are old data. 1,840 units of fertilizer used in the farmlands. A lot of that runs off and goes to the Gulf of Mexico, and there's a problem in the dead zone of the Gulf. But how come we have a problem in the Northeast? We don't apply that kind of fertilizer in the Northeast. But what we do is move that food, which contains some of that fertilizer. And 600 units of fertilizer nitrogen show up in the northeastern United States because we ship food there. So when you buy meat or vegetables even, or beans, when you buy natural products for your food in the northeastern markets, you're bringing nitrogen that was used to fertilize those crops from other places. And so we have come up with a way of moving this stuff around. And so we're having impacts over a much wider scale of waterways than you might have anticipated. And eventually a lot of them reach the coast. Growing meat is especially problematical because you not only feed them crops that are grown with fertilizer, but they are a high protein source food. So they have high nitrogen in them. So they need more nitrogen in their food. You don't need very much nitrogen in your food. The average growing child needs the nitrogen, the protein in about an anchovy of food a day. So if you eat more than an anchovy and you're a growing child, you're already getting too much nitrogen. And where do you think the nitrogen goes? It goes away. But there is no way. So that's why so now we've come full circle. We're back to my introductory point. Pretty well. We fertilize our gardens. We drive our cars. Oh, I'm not going to finish that sentence because I'm saying it in another moment. We've got those meat products and all that food which comes from other places where it's grown. The industrial agriculture produces the food which is then brought to us wherever we live. We eat that. Most of it is not assimilated in our body because most of us are not growing new tissue very often. There's a turnover, and so we need some protein in our diet, but we don't need it as adults. Children need it, but they don't need nearly as much as they do. So a lot of that nitrogen in our food and it's produced in those other pathways that I've talked about, all are ending up in the environment, and in many cases, washing off the landscape and finding their way to the coastal waters. That's essentially a point that I made earlier, but that's how we got there and all the processes that are contributing to that. So we have all these new sources of nitrogen being stripped out of the nitrogen gas and brought into the active cycle. And then we put all of those into the natural world. And in the aquatic system, in any system, when we fertilize the plants, they grow, right? No big surprise. Phytoplankton grow really fast because they're small. Macroalgae has almost no supportive tissue. The leafy stuff, the leafy plants that the kids stand up in the bay are algae, and they don't have much structure. They just have a very delicate tissue, which is all photosynthetic. So they are fast growing also. And the seagrasses, the ones that I spoke favorably about earlier, are complex plants with roots and seeds, with roots and flowers and seeds that live underwater in their whole life, but they're structurally complex. And a lot of the biology goes to making like a tree. Most of a tree isn't living. It's got all that wood, and then it's got all its photosynthetic leaves. Seagrasses are a complex plant like that. They have roots and they have structural material, and then they have some photosynthetic material. So they're complicated organisms and they're much more slow growing. And we care about them because they are the indicator of a healthy aquatic coastal ecosystem, but also because they're the habitat for lots of important species that we care about. So I won't spend any time on this. My note says to me, skip it or go quickly. This is what scientific evidence would look like. So these are graphs of data points that people remember. This is the number of houses in the watershed. The grass is hidden. And this is how much nitrogen was delivered from the landscape. And look at that. There's a very strong correlation, but in this case, we expect we understand why it is that if you build lots of houses and people live on the watershed, you're going to get a lot of nitrogen delivered per square unit area, like per every acre, every year. And then if you say, let's use this axis, which is this axis is now the same as this axis. If we increase the nitrogen delivered per unit area per year, what happens to the amount of fieldgrass area? It goes from 50% to 10% change. So those kinds of data are what scientists look at. This is what the Nature Conservancy publicizes to try to make the message to the people who live around Great South Bay. It's the same story. Nutrient input, nutrient limited, increasing nutrient loading, optimal habitat. They need some nutrients because they're going to grow, but too much and the whole system starts to break down. So this is a slide from the Nature Conservancy's website on Great South Bay, and that's part of the problem. And so they are saying this problem in a way that they hope will reach the public better than my guys. What do you think? Okay, so it's a bummer. So many of the environmental problems have a bad guy. It's pretty easy to find the bad guy, in my opinion, maybe some people disagree, in the tobacco problem. In the tobacco industry, people get sick from using the product, and somebody did that on purpose. They didn't really want to make people sick, but they sure knew they were doing it. In lots of environmental issues, someone is making a lot of money off this product, and they're doing things that they know are wrong. That may be the case now, but for a long time, it really was just under the radar. Remember, I told you that we told the sanitary engineers that we wanted to remove the organics, it's smelling and gross, and we wanted to kill the pathogens, And that's all we care about. So all the septic tanks that are built in Point of Woods were built with a goal in mind that they mostly achieved. They were never asked to remove nitrogen or even phosphorus. It happens to be lucky because the phosphorus pretty much absorbs the minerals in the sand and in the soil. So we get rid of that one for free, but the nitrogen does not. And the nitrogen in our system now is the problem. We thought it was one of those inorganic building blocks that we didn't have to worry about. And now they've reared up their heads and now they're causing all these problems. So who are the bad guys? It is the activities of people driving their cars, rain washing water off of the impervious surfaces of roads and parking lots, and the food that we eat and the way we dispose of that food. And so, who are the bad guys? In the words of Pogo, in the immortal words of Pogo, yup, son, we have met the enemy and he is us. Now, nobody laughed. I have to send a tangent on here. How many have heard of the cartoon strip Pogo by now? I went. 3 people in the audience. So the first problem is, and Jill, the first problem is nobody's heard of Pogo. He was a very long-running and famous cartoonist. This is a forgot what kind of a number it was. I'll tell you in a minute. Anyway, and this was a long-running strip written by a guy named Kelly. I said on Pakistan. And Pogo had it right. The second thing is, how many know we have met the enemy and he is ours? Have you heard the famous quotation, we have met the enemy and he is ours? That was Oliver House's parent, the 1813 Lake Erie victory. So to get this joke, you have to know about Pogo and you have to know about Oliver House Perry. And it's not surprising that not very many people do anymore. So this whole joke is a problem because it's a double whammy. These two things don't fit. Well, you need to know that the double whammy expression came from Walt Kelly and the Pogo cartoon. Okay, so what are we going to do about it? We're heading down the home stretch now. What can we do? Less fertilizer. If you put fertilizer on plants in your house or garden, you're probably doing what is recommended by the vendor or by the supplier. This is the recommended dose. This actually, I think, is probably the fertilizer used in industrial commercial agriculture, but I think homeowners probably do it even more so. It says something on the label, and probably you add a little more because if some fertilizer is good, a little more is better. But notice that the growth in the product, the increase in your yield starts to flatten off way back here. So you are being advised to fertilize more than you need to. Why in the world would the person who sells you the fertilizer want you to encourage you to use more than you need? Well, they make money when you use more fertilizer than you need. But you probably industrial commercial agriculture and homeowners are probably applying much more fertilizer than they need to. All that material is not taken up by the plant and used for growth. It is wasted. So as we apply more fertilizer, in this case nitrogen, we waste that nitrogen and it goes into the environment. So that's the first thing, less fertilizer. These are some scenarios about the effect of the growing population over time. So you've seen these types of things for fossil fuel use and human populations and the climate problem. This is a comparable graph with the nitrogen problem. And this is the business as usual with the standard US diet and the continuing pressure to export grain internationally. And it's all grown with fertilizer, which requires the fixing of nitrogen from the atmosphere. And if we say, no, we're gonna, with 25% work, the same marketplace, but just use 25% fertilizer, 25% less fertilizer than is presently used, and this was in 2002, so they haven't solved this problem. They're not doing it right now, I'm pretty sure of that. But the point is that would level off this problem. But in fact, we could actually do better. These are changes in diets from, that's the one I just showed, that's the standard diet. This is the constant grain export, which sort of levels off. The Swedish diet, I don't know, Swedish diet is, we'd have to read the paper, or the Mediterranean diet with lots of that, we can actually cause an improvement in this problem by changing diet in the average US household. And so that's one thing. there's a couple things there that we can do to help. There are technical solutions. In contrast, no, I don't think. Technical solutions exist for improving the situation and reducing the delivery of nitrogen to the environment. Reduced fertilizer, as you said, animal waste, the combined animal capos are those, they grow pigs and chickens in these combined units in very dense amounts, very dense numbers, and they don't treat that waste at all. There's no sewage treatment of that waste. It's dumped in ponds, and eventually it just seeps into the ground. It also evaporates. The ammonium goes in the air, and there are big studies of the southeastern U.S. where downwind of these CAFOs, animal feeding, vast numbers of big animals being fed excessively rich food to grow them fast to the marketplace, release enormous amounts of waste. We could treat that waste as we do for people. Right now, it's not treated. There's no rules that say. Vehicle exhaust standards and hybrid vehicles. Wow, you heard that? That would help us with the CO2 problem. That would also help us because by using less petroleum and fossil fuels, we'd be fixing less nitrogen that was present in those fuels. Industrial emissions are the same sort of problem. Anywhere we're burning fossil fuels, we're causing the problem to be worse. So anything we do with those, so there's a double improvement there for the CO2 problem as well. And then suburban sprawl, the more and more houses spread out with green grassy lawns that are over fertilized. There could be better guidance on how to fertilize your lawns. I can tell you right now, just use less. But the lawn fertilization is a problem. The sprawl, where people want to live in a larger lot size with grass or lots of plantings, as well as improving the septic treatment. So now we're down to, we're almost to how we're going to remediate this problem and what the point we're going to do about it. The word denitrification is the process by which, and I've hardly mentioned this, about to mention it again, the process by which that active nitrogen in the form of those building blocks can be put back into the atmosphere as that inert nitrogen gas. That happens. It can happen in nature. There's a few organisms that can do that, but mostly it's very difficult to accomplish. It takes a lot of energy and some unusual environmental conditions for those organisms to be favored. But there is a process by which we can treat our sewage differently and get rid of that nitrogen almost away. We can put it back into the atmosphere as inert nitrogen gas. And that's the only way out of this problem, really. As long as it's circulating round and round in the ecological loop, it's going to continue to cause problems, plus we're adding more. So I don't even know whether that's expensive by TEP state standards. This quote was designed to say it's not very much to treat this fertilizer, to treat the sewage better. So how do we get to go away? Well, you've got the preview. The only way, I did a little superficial research. I don't think anybody has a method for turning nitrate or ammonium back into N2 gas, which is called denitrifying it or denitrification. There are those organisms that do this. That's what they do for a living. They're really good at it. There's no other way to do that except create a little micro habitat for them in your treatment plant, in your treatment facility that says, we have a special box for you, and we're going to let the bacteria that do the denitrification need to have a special habitat because they need to have essentially zero oxygen. But if you give them lots of carbon to eat and some nitrogen, nitrate in the water, and no oxygen, then they say they're happy and they'll turn that nitrogen into N2 gas and they'll consume that carbon. So there is a trick that nature has figured out. And now the sanitary engineers are being asked, wait, you now have to change. The challenge we've given you is different. It isn't just because sewage is smelly and has pathogens in it. We now have to get rid of those building blocks too. So redesign our systems, and that's what's going on. This is a historical idea that started in 1996. Lewis Schipper in New Zealand tried an innovative plan to intercept groundwater with nitrogen. So start with this diagram of a little marsh of the coastline. And here's the green landscape, and it must be, I guess they're fertilizing it here, I'm not sure what. So the blue lines represent the flow of groundwater. It would be like an aquifer, but this one isn't being tapped for a drinking water source. But groundwater flows underground down slope. And so the blue lines represent water containing material that has reached into it from the overlying land. And as it flows towards the coast, it is compressed. So this line goes down, but this one comes up. Why would that be? Because the salt water is seeping in underground. And salt water is more dense than fresh water. And so the seepage of fresh water is squeezed into a very narrow little band. And when it enters the coastline, it is now a very well-defined area. So something which was quite large and diverse and really hard to locate, when it hits the coastline, is now very narrow and very easily identified. So if we could treat it there, maybe we could help solve this problem. So in '96, Shipper dug a big trench and made a box. Here's the box. And he filled it with wood chips. I told you it's not very sophisticated. I told you that the bacteria, the denitrifying bacteria, need a carbon source. Well, wood chips is a great carbon source. It's very slow to break down, and it's almost all pure carbon. So he filled his box with wood chips, and then he just left it there. And the groundwater that seeped through here would then have to pass through the porous sides of this box. And in the process of seeping slowly through a bed of compact wood chips, the nitrogen was denitrified and was gone, and no nitrogen reached the bay. And you say, really? And the answer is, really. This work was done by some colleagues I know, Betty Buckley at the University of Rhode Island. They did a pilot study doing this for the ponds in Rhode Island, in the southern coast of Rhode Island. So this was the idea when Shipper said, you know, we can use these creatures. These little microbes can help us. We just have to create a situation. I mentioned it has to be anoxic. This goes anoxic because you essentially seal it off, and as the water moves through, the organisms consume all the oxygen, and then it goes completely anoxic. So the organisms make it anoxic. All you got to do is give them a box and fill it with carbon. Pretty cool, right? Have you ever walked along Phragmites Beach at the end of our bay walk, just sort of in the water? It's not as pleasant walking there now as it used to. And occasionally you'll feel sort of a cold. You'll step into an area where the water seems quite cold compared to water you were just walking in. It'll sometimes happen even on the horseshoe crab beach across from the Duns. That is this freshwater seepage. It's coming out cold because it's been underground. And so when we feel it seeping out, if you're walking along, you can feel patches of cold water seeping out. That's this happening right here at Point of Woods. So I think it would be cool if when Point of Woods redoes the bulkhead on the bay side, they put a wood chips barrier right behind it, and then all of the nitrogen that's in our. So we're gonna treat our sewage treatment, but we're not gonna treat our outdoor showers. And the outdoor showers are coming from a water supply which has enhanced nitrogen from all the industrial inputs, and we use some other products that may have nitrogen in it. So our wonderful outdoor showers are actually contributing to some seepage. That's these blue lines, and we're not going to be asked to treat those. But what fraction of your water goes through the outdoor shower? It's a lot. It doesn't have it's not nearly as concentrated as what comes out of your septic tank. But that could be remediated too if we put wood chips along the bulkhead when we do it. That's my idea. You heard it here first. Okay, so now we're into the remediation point. There, I'm gonna just show two examples of the technology which is being developed and is being marketed by the companies that are working on it to solve this problem. These are the sanitary engineers who've been given a task to do a more complete job of removing the damaging chemicals from our water before it reaches estuaries phase. It's very complicated. We don't need to look at it all. This is a group which is not in contention for being used by Point of Woods, but for a reason I'll tell you in a second. But here's the septic tank, and here's the Nitrex filter, which is the nitrifying filter. It is simply a place that they use wood chips. They have this box, this sort of box here, has lots of wood chips in compartments, and the water flows through this system and then through this, and it essentially removes high volumes of nitrogen. Excuse me? Oh, that was outside. More beer? Did he say more beer? Yes, please. Okay, so this is the Nitrex denitrifying filter, and they're using simple wood chips. There are 8 different technologies that approved for use by Suffolk County. It's on their website. This is one of the 8. This is the same unit that John showed to the stockholders meeting, because this is one that's acceptable to Suffolk County. It's kind of cool. It fits in a pickup truck. I put that pickup truck. I put the emissions on the pickup truck. But it's a unit where the output from the septic system goes through a special compartment. This is the box. It doesn't have wood chips. It has little balls with lots of surface areas, so the denitrifying bacteria have lots of area to attach to grow, and they create an anoxic environment with a high surface area matrix that favors the growth of these organisms. And so that's one of the ones we're looking at. The key idea, I looked at all 8 of these, 8 units approved by Suffolk County, one of which is the Fuji Clean. My quick check indicates that all 8 of the ones that are approved basically create a box with a habitat that's suitable for the denitrifying bacteria. They're all using the same organisms that wood chip plant uses. They don't all use wood chips, but they're all taking advantage of a natural critter to do this job for us. And that's what we're being asked to do. This is my punchline at the end. That's what we're being asked to do, and why. Sorry, the abrupt ending. Is okay? So I don't want to talk a lot about the technologies. I don't know very much about the technologies. I did read up briefly on what the design strategies are for the 8 ones that are approved by Suffolk County. And my penultimate statement there in was, they do it in different ways, but they all take advantage of these bacteria, which are in nature and do this for a living, and we can take advantage of them. And so building a machine that will take advantage of them to do it is not cheap, but it's the right thing to do. And this is why we're being asked to spend this money and do this at Porter Woods. Now, is that a better ending?
Well, Professor Kremer did a great job. I just want to fill in one of the blanks that where I started, which was this is really the first in what we hope will be a series of community discussions about this issue, and it's really community education. We're hoping to do something around beefsteak this year as well, so there'll be more on that, where we're hopeful to bring maybe someone from Suffolk County, maybe someone from 1 or 2 of these vendors, and some others who are experts in this area to start to parse through what the right solution options could be for Point of Woods. There's no sort of ready solution at the moment, but we do know that our neighbors right now, and it's going to happen with the casino project, are being asked to make these decisions about what they're going to do in their individual homes. So we're trying to accelerate this process. What Jim did today was a huge community service. And you have time for questions, correct?
Yeah, I'd love to take questions. And
Great.
Pat, we'll start with audience questions if you got them, and then Pat has Zoomers. And we'll give
How
them
many
a
are on the
chance.
Zoom, Pat?
How many participants do we have?
I think we have 9.
9. So it's about 60 or 65 of us who got together this afternoon to do this.
I really appreciate
Jim,
it.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Question.
Why is nitrogen is inert, it's molecules bonded together, and they don't touch it? Why are they messing up whatever all they're messing up?
Yeah, if it stayed, it's a good question. It's fundamental to the whole issue. As long as, if it stayed in that inert box, it truly is inert, and it would not mess anything up. It isn't the nitrogen atom. So atom is a single atom. The nitrogen gas is written N2, and that N2 gas is the one that's triple bonded together. It doesn't interact with anything. It doesn't cause trouble. It's just inert. It's in the atmosphere, and it's just there. It is when we take that N2 gas, which is harmless, and break those bonds with special techniques and energy and chemical techniques, we turn it from nitrogen gas into nitrate or ammonia. Well, you heard of ammonia fertilizer and nitrate fertilizer, not furniture. Nitrogen in the form of nitrate or in the form of ammonia is an active form. It's an active building block, and it stimulates plant growth. So all of the problems we've created are because we have made more fertilizer. It's mostly fertilizer, but it's coming from every. I hope you got the point that it's all of us, and it's many of our activities. It's what we eat, it's where we go, it's what we do, it's what we put in our gardens. It is us, folks. Everyday use. Most of what we do, I can't say that. A lot of the things that we do have an impact in delivering nitrogen. And if we buy it in a store, it probably came from a fixing process, which took it from the atmosphere where it was out of reach and out of mind and brought it into the active biosphere. That is the way it's happened. And I tried to explain some of those real world ways that the nitrogen going into Great South Bay from the Point Woods community comes from the food we buy at the store, which came from Long Island maybe, or maybe some of it came from the central US or somewhere else. But that nitrogen in that food came here and it's going to go into Great South Bay, not because it was nitrogen gas. If they'd left it there, we'd be fine.
So if we could take the atmosphere nitrogen from the matrix, so is that process not reversible? It's only the bacteria that are able to do that.
Yeah, the process of taking the nitrogen gas and breaking it down and oxidizing it, or and making it from inactive and inert to active form, which is what I was trying to do at first time. It's done by lightning, which is a clue that it takes a lot of energy to do this. When a lightning bolt strikes, some of the nitrogen gas in the atmosphere is turned from N2 into nitrate. Well, that's a lot of energy. That process we do with chemistry. There's a process, I think it's called the Haber process, who knows? I think it's the Haber process. That's an industrial process for doing what lightning does, and that is a one way. But the turning it back from nitrate is only done by these microbes. There may be some technically elaborate chemistry methods, but they're not widely, they don't happen very often, and my guess is they're very energetically costly and expensive. So it's a two-way street, but those streets are very narrow paths and hard to get through both ways.
Jim, for your presentation, very informative and on target, I'd say. The solutions that you presented there, like with these solutions on the scale, you're always a problem, and we're in a community with a lot of houses and businesses. Is that solution scalable to the community level? Or
So the question asked was, are these technical solutions, maybe they can see the picture, let me go to this one, the FujiClean unit. So that looks like it's designed for one cottage or one house or something. So the output from more than one house would reach a common denitrification place. That's one of the issues they're going to talk about. I think we'll get a bit more.
Thank you. As I said at the last meeting, the board actually had a study convened that was delivered in February where we talked about some of these options. And the options included what we consider to be the do-nothing solution, which means that we would have individual FujiClean or other systems cottage by cottage. But the other part that's being studied, and the wastewater committee is going to look at this in a lot more detail, is something known as the cluster system. And a cluster could be as small as 2, or perhaps as large as 60 or 70. So, when you think about how we might do that at Point of Woods, it becomes really interesting pretty quickly, because in some areas, perhaps maybe in the cottage area where there's lots of concentration, it might well be that we could have a system that could have a large cluster that would have the leaching field out somewhere around where the sports field is. So there's a lot of options there that we're going to consider. And if anyone's interested in trying to help us think through that, we'd love to have you join the committee and think through that. But that's a terrific question. And that's actually the crux of the answer that we're trying to get to for the community. One, what are the economics around doing single versus cluster systems, small clusters versus larger clusters? Jonathan Myers here, he's leading the charge on that. So if you're interested in helping him with that, I'm sure he'd love to have more folks involved. But that's really the essence of the question that we're trying to get to. And again, we've been formed now only 4 months, so we're just at the beginning of understanding ourselves, the nitrogen problem, and what we have to do to try to remediate it.
Yep. Yes, another question.
Probably like organic food would still have fertilizer, even if it's organic, right? So that's still producing, it's still driving that whole.
Yeah, is that the question? That's a great question. So the question from Monica was, if we buy organic foods, is that better? Is that better? And yes, they're probably fertilized, but depending on the source of the fertilizer and the rates of application, it can be way, way, way better. If they use sources of nitrogen and phosphate that are recycled, like composted, fertilizer and compost is already part of the natural system. Think of it as a loop that's spinning around and cycling materials. And as long as you just recycle that materials, you're fine. We would have no atmospheric carbon problem, the CO2 and climate, if all we did was recycle the CO2. It's because we get excessive amounts from fossil fuels that's been buried for so long that was never part of our contemporary active cycle. So whenever we use recycled nutrients and make our fertilizer that way, we are not making the problem worse. Unfortunately, some of that nitrogen is in the loop now because of this problem, and so we've got to denitrify and get it back out. So depending on how those organic farmers raise their units and where the fertilizer comes from, it could make a difference. And I don't know how individual farmers practice that. If they go to the Ace Hardware store, which they don't, and buy ammonium nitrate, that didn't come from somebody's compost pile.
I'm just going to announce
Oh,
to
what was
my,
that?
just to my Zoom audience, if you want to ask a question, please enter your name on the chat or just say, I want to speak. And then I'll unmute you and allow you to ask your question.
Okay, we have another question.
Jim, with that, that barrier,
Yeah. No.
do you know how much nitrogen that actually fix that?
It's in the paper. I have the report. I don't know, but it is known. It's a lot. I mean, when my major professor did this work, this was a wood chip pit in the Rhode Island coastal ponds, and it was, I don't remember the numbers, but it was gone. It depends on the flow rates, and you have to tune it, and all the publications talk about properly designed. So you've got to do it right, but if you do it right, it's magic.
How often do you have to switch out?
What's the question?
It appears to degrade so slowly that you don't. The wood chips last 40 or 50 years at least. Okay.
Catherine Johnson has a question.
What about adding into the mix the issue of sea rise and sea level rise?
Sea level rise.
Yes, I get it. So how does sea level rise interact with this problem? It certainly changes, it changes the environment in which our septic systems have to operate. We already have seen the large septic systems that have been put in the last few years in some houses in Point of Woods are above ground and really enormous. That's because they have to be above the water table. And we have not only a shallow water table, we have a little freshwater lens, which exists in between the bay and the ocean and is truly lens shaped, but it's not very deep. And when we have a high tide, we get what the Florida people are experiencing, which is called sunny day flooding. There's no rain, there's no fresh water input from the sky with the rain, but all of a sudden we have floods all over, and that's because the salt water, remember I showed you, here in the graph, I'm sorry, the Zoom people, remember those compressed groundwater flow lines that shows the influence of the salt water coming in under the freshwater lens at Point of Woods. And that's what causes the yacht club, sports field to flood more than we would have expected. Sometimes even on a sunny day with a super high tide, when we didn't have any rain, the groundwater is being forced to the surface. So that's what Catherine, I think, was asking about. Yes, indeed, as sea level rise and bay level rise aggravate this problem of not enough place that it pushes our fresh water around, that's going to be coming to the surface. Well, that means it's unpleasant to walk through, but it's also going to compromise the function of some of these treatment facilities. So they have to be designed in a way to be above that, I think, or maybe the Fuji Clean thing is a self-contained box that can sit in water, I don't know. Good question.
It can be strapped down.
It can be strapped down, but it's not permeable, so the fresh water doesn't get in it. Any more questions?
Why don't you say on your, you'll be around here.
Okay, yes, I think we should stop. It'll take us a little while to break down, and if you want to come up and chat, I would love to talk more, or you know how to reach me, and you can imagine I don't mind talking about this stuff.